Hey folks, it's Sean here from the Calling Out community and CallOut Films. And today I'm continuing my video series, Last Days Dawning. With a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, I will show how the biblical signs of the times, which warn of a worldwide time of chaos and suffering to come called the tribulation, are being fulfilled right now, today. Killing billions has never been so fun. That's what IGN wrote, the video game and entertainment site, in its review of one of the most popular iPhone games ever. A Plague Inc. has been downloaded over 120 million times, played 1.5 billion times, and it has a simple goal: create the most lethal and effective plague possible, and kill as many people as possible before the disease is cured. Game creator James Vaughn did such a great job of building computer models of how diseases outbreak and then spread into his game that he got the attention of the US Centers for Disease Control, who invited him in April 2013 to come and speak to their staff about his game. One CDC staffer later said that the game was a great tool to teach the public about pandemics. And soon, folks, the world is going to be desperate for that info because the Bible records in Matthew 24:7, Mark 13:8, and Luke 21:11 that Jesus warned us of several great disasters soon to come. Earthquakes, which we're going to cover in our next video, famines, which we covered in our last video, and pestilences or plagues, from the Greek word loimos, which means a devastating, contagious, or infectious epidemic disease. And these two Gospels are so similar, they're known as synoptic. That means to look at or study together, because they're often telling the same stories in the same order, and even with the same wording. Now, the one exception, of course, is the Gospel of John. He doesn't talk about these plagues killing millions at all. But then, John wrote 4 other Bible books, including the book of Revelation. And there, of course, we read of a quartet of supernatural stallions, ridden by 4 hellish horsemen that are unleashing God's judgment on the earth. Revelation 6:6 catches up with them and says, one of them will be death, and Hades will follow with him. Authority will be given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by the wild beasts of the earth. And of those 4 horsemen, death is introduced last, and he's the only one introduced by name. You know why? Because everyone's going to eventually meet him. English Bibles often call his horse pale, but that's a mistranslation. The actual word comes from the Greek chloros, which is the root word of chlorophyll, the green pigment in plants. In ancient Greek medical literature, it's used for the yellowish-greenish color of a corpse. Now, John says in Revelation 6:6 that death will unleash the same disasters as the other synoptic gospels do. In fact, it even lists them in the same order. Wars and rumors of wars from the synoptics is probably the same as the to kill with sword mentioned in Revelation 6:6. And it mentions famines and pestilences or plagues as well, which we're going to discuss today. Now, many will also die by wild beasts, which is a really poor translation of the Greek word therion. It's used 39 times in Revelation, and every single one, it refers to the Antichrist or his government system. Revelation 6:6 says that 1/4 of the earth, or 25%, are going to die. Folks, that's 1.9 billion people today. The UN estimates that 2,000 years ago, the world population was about 300 million. And as of August 11, 2019, according to this population clock from the US Census Bureau, the US alone has more than that. Over 329 million people. This must have been an overwhelming vision of sickness and death for the Apostle John, based on his population of the day. Well, here's an example. The World Health Organization said in October 2018 that new cases of diabetes alone rose from 108 million in 1980 to 422 million in 2014. It's going to rise again by another 220 million in the next 2 decades. So if you do the math, in just 50 years, nearly twice as many people became new diabetics as lived in the whole world in John's day. Ironically, it's been just over 666 years since the worst pandemic in human history finally ended in 1351 AD, the bubonic plague. After spreading across Europe for 4 years, it killed 25% of the continent, nearly 200 million people. Patients would develop a fever or headaches, vomiting, painful lymph nodes, where the infected flea from a rat had bitten the person. But if you didn't know better, it felt much like you just had the flu, which really sucks because it was only when the next horrific symptoms started to develop that the person would get confirmation that they did actually have the plague, and then it was too late for treatment. That symptom was where the nickname Black Death comes from, and it's when septicemic plague develops, that the skin on a patient's fingers, toes, even their nose starts to turn black and dies, which is followed by weakness, abdominal pain, shock, internal bleeding for less than 10 more days, where mercifully 40 to 90% finally die. Now, of course, you'll remember the people facing bubonic plague were literally living in the Dark Ages, as was their medicine. It was probably as much voodoo as science. There were weird ideas about how to fight off the plague. In fact, some believe we still sing about them today in one of the most famous nursery rhymes of all time. You remember, it goes like this.
We are dead.
In fact, during the plague, so many were falling down dead that men would roll carts up and down the streets every day, calling for people to bring out their family members or friends that had died the night before so they could roll their bodies out of town and burn them. That's a pretty dramatic step to take to stop a disease. And I can hear it now. Well, thanks for the history lesson, but why do I care? Because it's still happening. In fact, in the last 5 years, Madagascar has had 2 outbreaks of bubonic plague, killing 250 people. In fact, the UN says 300 to 600 new cases of the plague are reported in that country alone every year. How is that still possible 6 centuries later? And the UN has protected us so far, or at least so we believe. But what if the disease breaks out of their strict quarantine zones? And dare I ask, what if it's allowed to actually spread on purpose by some evil person? None of us are immune to the plague. No one on Earth has been vaccinated in advance against it. Unless, of course, you're living in the current danger zone. And most of us would be dead in 2 weeks before the majority of us ever even got to see a doctor. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, the law of averages. Today in North America, we pay enormous amounts to run our healthcare system. In fact, the U.S. federal healthcare budget is $3.2 trillion with a T. The Canadian province of Ontario alone is going to spend $58 billion this year. But in a major medical disaster like a plague, most people have no access to medical care. How do I know that? Because according to the Canadian Institute for Health Information, Canada has 73,000 hospital beds. Enough for 0.2% of our 37 million residents. And you Americans think you're doing so much better? Think again. The American Hospital Association reports that they have 931,000 hospital beds in the US, which is enough for 0.28% of America's 327 million people. Folks, not to be too rude, but if you think your government or your healthcare system are going to take care of you in the event of a major disaster, you're living in Narnia, or you need to put the bomb down. You need to understand that people are already planning for a mass casualty event. Here's one example. Vantage Products Corporation in Georgia makes plastic grave liners and burial vaults. In 2009, they were rumored to have a big order from the Federal Emergency Management Administration. The company said that this photo shows 60,000 of them stacked up, so many in fact that they had to rent land from a local farmer. Several highly detailed blog sites addressed this FEMA conspiracy, and they were written by bloggers that had way too much inside information to be considered unbiased or unrelated. The company itself finally addressed the FEMA rumors by stating that the vaults already belonged to people who had bought pre-planned funeral packages. Oh, okay. Because of course, those are incredibly popular nowadays, aren't they? And they made 60,000 grave liners today for funerals that aren't going to be used for 1 to 50 years from now. Their factory could start up any time to make a big order. They're not shipping them over from China. Sorry, Ling Ding Wing. And stockpiling a few thousand makes sense, but renting land to store 60,000 or more? Think of the cost of wages and raw materials alone just to make them as well. But not to worry, it gets weirder. Suddenly in 2010, all of those 60,000 grave liners just disappeared. A fact that the same unrelated bloggers somehow had noticed and paid enough attention to point out to people. Where did all those grave liners go? If the company had nothing to hide, why were they hiding? They didn't sell them all. They didn't have a mass shipment of pre-planned funerals taking place. That would be idiotic to believe. And this was clearly a short-term solution because I checked their headquarters on Google Maps today, here in September 2019. Remember, this was their headquarters pre-2010. Here they are today in 2019. The pre-planned funeral business isn't growing that fast. They're stockpiling for a major event, regardless of how they deny it. Oh, and by the way, it looks like they now have 3 times as many as they did before. Well, that's just an isolated incident, you're probably thinking. Just a business that doesn't know how to run itself. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not true. In 2009, the very next year, after the Georgia company had been embroiled in that FEMA controversy, 2 YouTube videos appeared, both with shocking discoveries. They had giant burial vaults found just outside of Houston, Texas, and Phoenix, Arizona. Each of the vaults can hold up to 20 bodies, some people estimate, and they were in the process of being buried by the hundreds, with a capacity of thousands of people. In just those 2 cities alone. Neither city had a major natural disaster that warranted them, so why would they buy so many of them up front? Why would they then pay to have somebody bury them? And why were they hiding them from the public in general? If so, they failed miserably because both situations were exposed. But how many other cities were doing the same thing and got away with it? And how did officials in Phoenix explain it all? Oh, here we go. They're going to use them to bury veterans, because apparently they're planning for them to die by the thousands in the near future. So there's either really sketchy situations going on out there, or some pretty dramatic evidence that preparations are being made for mass casualties. And at the same time, several diseases have made some very suspicious comebacks, in my opinion, in the last decade or so especially. Measles was declared eliminated in 2000. Well, suddenly, from January 1st of this year, 2019, 1,182 new cases of measles have been confirmed in 30 states, the greatest number since 1992. In fact, I'm going to make a bold statement here. You have never been in more danger of becoming physically devastated or dying from a highly contagious disease than you are right now today. In fact, let's take a quick look at the top 5 most common infectious diseases in the world. And you should know each of them impacts as many people as lived in the whole world when Jesus was alive. And continue to watch this series as we continue to show you how this really is the last days dawning.